One thing I've often been asked by skeptics who aren't convinced about the Gospel's historical reliability is how we should treat the birth narratives, particularly in Matthew and Luke, shepherds, wise men, and so on. A lot of people claim that they were essentially invented after the fact as a sort of way of giving Jesus a sort of, some sort of royal arrival on the scene, as it were. What's your view on those kinds of criticisms?
Let me just tell you a little story about that to show where our culture is sitting on that. About 15, 20 years ago, I was phoned up shortly before Christmas by a television station saying they were putting together a program which was going to talk about the birth narratives, and they wanted a New Testament specialist to come on and say, actually, probably that stuff never actually happened. And this was just a researcher on the phone. And I said, supposing I was to come on and say, actually, there's quite a reasonable chance that it might have done. And there was a pause. And then she said, I don't think that's what my producer was looking for. So I said, thank you, goodbye. But, that's how our culture is slanted right now. They don't want to hear that actually, I'm an ancient historian. I study texts in which most of the incidents that we know about in the ancient world are described once and once only. That's how you get from Tacitus or Suetonius or any of the other great writers. And even Josephus, the great Jewish historian, who tells the same story in the Antiquities, then he does the small version in the Jewish War, and a bit of it as well in his autobiography. Quite often, he's talking about things only once. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. And he is, of course, writing it all 20, 30 years later, some cases even more than that. But historians have to say, well, that's a bit of evidence. How do we weigh that? What's the probability? What's the likelihood, etc.? And so the danger then is that some Christians say, well, because the Bible is inspired, we must believe that it all happened exactly as so. And I want to say, well, yes, I am happy to say that the Bible is the book that God has given us, and I live with that. But if I am making an argument to a fellow ancient historian who isn't a believer, I think I will say, well, you know perfectly well, there's lots of things that happened that you would write into your books, which are only in one story and may well have been written up 100 years later. So when we're talking about shepherds, well, yes, that's in principle probable, possible, depending on what you think about angels. Likewise, when you're talking about wise men, depending on what you think about comets and so on. And of course, there's been a lot of work done on what star or comet it was, and some quite interesting stuff. I haven't followed all the recent research on that, but people have said you can actually pinpoint some things which might help you date when that's going on. So I want to say, from the point of view of making a case to a non-believer, I would say keep an open mind on that. Stuff happens. Interesting, having slagged off one particular broadcaster, the BBC some years ago did a Christmas thing, I think it was a 6-part or something, 20-minute or half-hour programmes, where they'd got the guy who did the script for EastEnders.
That's right.
And they gave him the Christmas stories and said, do it. It was spectacular.
It was very good,
and it was thoroughly believable.
Yes.
It made sense as a narrative. And I thought people need to see that, because making sense is what history is supposed to do.
For podcast episodes, bonus content, and to ask your question, sign up at askntwright.com.